The Palace of Versailles, with all its gilded majesty, still attracts thousands of tourists. People from Germany, Britain, France, and Japan flock to the palace to savor the intimacy of the royals, but also to keenly discover the filth that lies behind the scenes. They've all heard of a stinky Versailles, of members of the court relieving themselves in the corners of stairwells, of a king holding audiences on his throne, a chair with a hole in the seat. Preconception?
They didn't have the same means for cleaning the palace.
Cleanliness was defined by having good breath and feet that didn't smell.
Perfumes came in to mask the lack of cleanliness.
So where did this bad reputation come from? Were the royals really as dirty as their stinky palace?
One very important point to make is each era is convinced it's clean.
Where is the line between fantasy and truth, between dirty and clean, at the Palace of the Sun King? Legend has it that Louis XIV only took one bath in his long life. Is that just another preconception, or was Louis really not a fan of bathing?
There were no bathrooms at the time of Louis XIV, no specific places for washing. People bathed in the river. They could also bathe in their chamber, in which case a copper bathtub would be brought in and filled. But one has to admit it was rare for the king to take a bath. In his youth, the king used to go to what we now call spas. Male members of the aristocracy would gather there to talk of this and that, and notably of their mistresses.
So Louis XIV did bathe more than once in his lifetime. However, cleanliness is still a sensitive issue, and while the Sun King did enjoy the palace ponds, it was to cool down, not to wash. What's more, back then the term hygiene was rarely used.
These days, we might see it as a filthy place, a relatively stinky place, a place very far from our present-day understanding of hygiene. But back then, they didn't see it like that. Louis XIV was convinced he was remarkably hygienic.
More importantly, water wasn't thought of as hygienic. On the contrary, water was thought to contain all ills, real and imaginary. People believed that once the pores of the skin had been opened by hot water, the body was all the more vulnerable to miasmas and recurrent epidemics. It was clearly the plague that brought about this irrational fear of water.
Water wasn't considered dangerous before the spate of plagues. But as the plague was airborne, people feared it might be waterborne too. Why? Because hot water opened the pores, and so bathtubs, which were widespread in the Middle Ages, became sources of anxiety. Louis XIV often met with other people to bathe early in his reign, but he gradually came to believe that water was dangerous.
Many historians believe the fear of epidemics led to the reign of filth at Versailles. But it wasn't only the plague that was feared. Once hot water had opened the pores, bodily humors might escape, resulting in the loss of vital forces, imbecility, and even miscarriages. And when bathing was prescribed by physicians, it was for medicinal reasons, to evacuate ills. Louis XIV was therefore forced to take a bath, to clean the inside of the body, like leech bleeding and other purges.
Louis XIV was frequently bled, once every 2 weeks, because bleeding was thought to purge the inside of the body. One of the biggest fears was humors, which were considered to be the most corruptible substances for the body. What was the answer? To expel them, through sweating, by purging, as seen in the plays of Molière, and by bleeding. This expulsion restored health, contrary to what we believe medically today, and also cleaned the inside of the body. Members of the court all sought a fresh and glowing complexion through minor medicinal practices such as enemas, to make their humors as clean as possible. There are amazing scenes in novels of the time of women being administered enemas by their maids, and then these same maids being bribed by the husband to give him an enema without his wife knowing. So this is proof of the practices we talked about before. There was a play on both appearance and cleanliness.
So if you weren't sick and there was no heat wave, no bathing. In Louis XIV's reign, there was only one bath at the palace, or rather one bathroom suite. The orangerie still contains a souvenir from this incredible room, an octagonal bath carved from a single block of Rouge de Reims marble. The king commissioned it for his favorite, the Marquise de Montespan. It was to be a central decorative piece of her luxury apartment.
Her apartment was planned at the early stage of Louis XIV's plans to enlarge the palace. And beyond pleasing himself, he wanted to impress his mistress. Louis XIV was madly in love with his favorite and was always out to impress her. She was striking, somewhat haughty, spirited, and had inherited the famous Mortemart wit, so nothing was too fine for her. When Louis XIV planned the apartment, entirely marble and porphyry, very precious stone, he was intent on astonishing her. The bath was not only a work of art, because it was carved from a single block, but it was also extremely expensive. The equivalent of 50 years' pay for a stonemason, or the price of a beautiful mansion on the outskirts of Paris.
But once again, the bath wasn't for reasons of hygiene. It was large for one reason. The king and his mistress could easily fit in as two, for relaxation, caresses, and eroticism, but not for washing. When Madame de Montespan was disgraced, she was forced to leave the upper story and move to the bathroom on the ground floor, the former site of their amour. The fall to the ground floor also symbolized her fall in the king's heart. Members of the court of Versailles were not keener bathers than the king, perhaps even less keen. Their apartments were too small for a bathtub, so if there was no tub, just how did they wash?
The term used at the court of Louis XIV was a dry wash, which means they cleaned themselves up, but without water. How did they go about this dry wash? They simply wipe themselves down with a white piece of cloth, sometimes soaked in some kind of acidic solution. This acidic solution was supposed to get rid of dirt and the smell of sweat. But it was, and I must insist on this to emphasize the lack of hygiene awareness at the time, a dry wash.
For Louis XIV, his wash was not only dry, but public. Mathieu Davina, scientific director of the Palace of Versailles, retraces the steps of those courtiers who, every morning, attended the so-called Rising of the King and his dressing.
This is Louis XIV's bedchamber, where he slept, and the so-called parade apartment. It's very richly decorated. He slept here every night and was awoken every morning in public at 8 o'clock or 8:30. You must imagine a camp bed for the king's personal valet, who would draw back the curtain saying, "Your Majesty, this is the hour." His old nursemaid, while she was still alive, was the first into his bedchamber to give him a good morning kiss. She died in 1688. Imagine this little old lady who had been Louis XIV's nursemaid. When he was 50, she was still the first to give him a good morning kiss. She would leave, as she wasn't an official attendee of the King's Rising, and she was followed by the so-called men of the faculty, his personal physician, who checked his pulse, and his surgeon, who checked the King's stools to make sure he was in good health. These men of the faculty then stood aside to make way for the courtiers, who entered according to their rank. Louis XIV was away. His valet put on his shirt and brought him aqua vitae, wine spirit, to wash his hands. It was 90% proof. The valet held a jug in his right hand and poured the spirit over the king's hands, with a tray in his left hand to catch any spillings. The king was handed a towel to dry his hands. Then he sat up to be shaved. It was fairly basic. His face was sponged with aqua vitae and then rinsed with fresh water. It was more of a spectacle to see the king rise and to be part of this royal intimacy.
It wasn't only the king. All the nobility dry-washed. Anne Fauré-Carlier, curator of the Decorative Arts Museum of Paris, reveals more about this intimate moment.
Painter Voiriot chose to depict a woman after rising and carrying out one of her first activities of the day, washing and dressing. It gives us a glimpse of one of this woman's intimate moments and lets us discover more about her morning ritual. She's already out of bed. 18th century noblewomen tended to rise early, and she's wearing a negligee, a light satin robe. Some of these paintings also show us the various people who were present at her washing and dressing, like the priest, there to hear her confession, the fabric merchant, there to show her his latest designs, and her secretary, there to take dictations of her first letters of the day, before delivering them to their correspondents.
At the court, small books were passed around, so small they could be slipped into a pocket. Known as treatises on health and manners, they laid out rules for new arrivals. All of them stressed the importance of cleanliness. But at Versailles, perhaps more than elsewhere, cleanliness was more a case of appearance. The supreme distinction was linen. It had to be snow white. Courtiers may not have bathed, but they changed clothes several times a day.
Clothing was triumphant. There was a gradual cascade of clothing, from the collar downwards, and on the legs, hose went upwards and finished with lace. At the cuffs, linen was also let out to be visible. What does this symbolize exactly? This is a fundamental point. It symbolizes the interior. Linen emerging from the vest is the inside coming out. It's a play on the inner and the exterior. It's fundamental.
More often than not, changes of clothing were due to sweat. Less dangerous than bathing, a new shirt was supposed, it was thought, to eliminate filth.
Cleanliness was clearly a matter of appearance. But it was also a matter of inner feeling and outer feelings. So clothing played a double role. It wasn't only about how the body felt, it was about displaying. So cleanliness was something you displayed. However, the inner feeling was also important too, because changing clothes was linked to personal sensitivity. One of the first to express this so magnificently was Montaigne, who said, "Bear with my sweat," which means he changed his clothes. There are many other examples. Take Princess Palatine. After leaving Marly for another chateau, she wrote, "I have traveled roads that were so dusty that on arrival I'm exhausted and have dust everywhere." What did Princess Palatine do? She wrote that she wiped herself down and changed clothes. That's definitely not washing.
As a fashion item or a display of cleanliness, linen was king. Aristocrats who wore white linen believed they were cleaner than peasants dressed in hemp. This fight for white was determined by the number of shirts or blouses contained in your wardrobe. Imagine the king's shirts piled up in trunks, just like his treasure.
Linen was a luxury product at the time, something that was excessively expensive. The king's wardrobe was on the ground floor, whereas his apartments were upstairs. So the trunks in his bedroom were for emergency. Valets didn't need to sprint downstairs. The king had spare shirts in his trunk. And they were very expensive, in cotton, linen, cloth more expensive than a piece of furniture or a painting. A painting we might buy at hundreds of millions of dollars cost only 20 to 40 pounds at the time, whereas shirts, tablecloths, and bed linen cost fortune.
Courtiers' wardrobes contained dozens of shirts. They were so precious to their owners that they are listed in posthumous inventories. Denis Brunat, a curator of the Decorative Arts Museum in Paris, shows us some of the rare and exceptional pieces kept in the museum's reserves. Court clothing was never washed. It was merely rubbed, scrubbed, and brushed as carefully as possible. Shirts, however, were given to washerwomen to be laundered, along with table and bed linen.
Shirts were essential because from the Middle Ages until the mid-19th century, they were the only undergarments to be worn by both men and women. Whenever you were undressed, you still had on your shirt. This is a man's shirt. The man would have been totally naked underneath. So the shirt was an undergarment both for the higher and lower parts of the body. The shirt was inseparable from the body. It was considered a second skin, hence the French expression to be ass and shirt, meaning that the shirt covered not just the body, but the buttocks too. So the body and the shirt were totally inseparable. These breeches may look a little weird, but they were usual back then. They're called fly breeches because they have a fly at the front with a number of buttons, all kinds of different buttons. And this flap here comes down, and then you unbutton here. And that way, when nature calls, well, you can do what you have to do. The fabric is beautiful and shiny. Imagine these as evening wear when the palace was lit by candlelight.
At the royal palace, being clean meant taking care of visible parts of the body. The more intimate parts weren't necessarily looked after, at least not in the 17th century. So how did they cover up bodily smells in a palace where courtiers competed to be the most elegant? The treatises on health and manners told them how to wipe their noses and suggested lotions and potions to cure bad breath and smelly feet. But it was impossible to cover up all bodily odors. So apothecaries were given the task of concocting sachets of perfumes for cloths, linen, and wigs. These scented sachets were inserted into folds placed under the armpits of doublets or at the hips of dresses, crowning perfume as the king of artifice.
One of the main uses of perfume was to cover up smells. Perfume compensated for the lack of cleanliness. The preferred scents of the 17th century were very heady, powerful, and animal, such as civet, musk, and amber, the three most widely used back then. As a young man, Louis XIV overused the heady, voluptuous perfumes of the 17th century, and in the end, he couldn't stand them. The moment he entered a room, he had the windows opened. In a carriage, he opened all the windows because he hated the smell of the women traveling with him. As
Louis XIV favored the very suave scent of orange blossom, He built a classical palace to protect his precious orange trees, especially imported from China, from the winter frosts. Because other than its perfume, orange blossom had virtue. It was said to be an aphrodisiac. From the Hall of Mirrors to the apartments, valets sprayed the palace here and there with the delicate fragrance. Only Madame de Montespan seemed not to care about her royal lover's taste and continued to pile on the perfume.
Madame de Montespan was a great fan of her perfumes and creams, and she would have herself rubbed down naked on her bed with outrageous strong scents. Louis XIV liked them a lot early on, but towards the end of her reign as his favorite, he was no longer able to stand them because they were so heady, and he attributed to them the migraines he'd been suffering from for a number of years. He made a remark to Madame de Montespan in public, which came as a real slap in the face to her. As she was about to climb aboard the Queen's carriage, he told her that she wore much too much perfume. In the late 1670s and early 1680s, Madame de Montespan was suspected of concocting potions to make the king stay in love with her, and also of plotting to kill his most recent mistress, Mademoiselle de Fontanges. The scandal shook up the entire court because some courtesans were accused of witchcraft and performing black magic ceremonies involving children, etc. So you can imagine that with all her strong perfumes, she became suspect in the eyes of Louis XIV.
Heady perfumes used to hide smells and to cast spells, and also as disinfectants. During an outbreak of plague or other epidemics, perfume was used as a purifying agent.
The role played by perfume makers during the plague was very important. In towns inflicted by the plague, victims flocked to buy perfumes, and often at very high prices. Perfume makers were located by entrances and in the busier streets, so that they could entice passers-by whom he dabbed with products to transform them in a way. Few people know that today. Then there's another practice which has been forgotten. It is installing in hospitals perfume burners to purify bad air. This made the daily lives of patients more tolerable. So these two practices help us understand today how in the 17th century, using perfumes meant having a feeling of getting rid of dirtiness. The use of perfume also led to a new demonstration of cleanliness, of appearing in other people's eyes, that is to say, of having a deep-down incarnation of cleanliness.
So perfume had become a status symbol to such an extent that distinctions were established. Royal perfumes, bourgeois perfumes, and perfumes for the poor. At the palace, perfume was clearly a luxury item. For sumptuous banquets, Louis XIV scented his fountains with orange blossom or jasmine water. But it was under Louis XV that the court of Versailles became known as the perfumed court, because being at the height of fashion meant wearing a different scent every day. The famous perfume of 1,000 flowers was created for Queen Marie Antoinette, an olfactory masterpiece composed of flowers from all seasons. Another illusion of cleanliness was makeup. Applying powder was cheating, masking your cards, camouflaging pockmarked cheeks. So faces were painted, and sentiments thus hidden. Courtesans had to be in control of both natural expressions and emotions.
In the 17th century, a new central hierarchy was established, and sight was top of the list, above smell, touch, and hearing. It was appearances that counted, what you saw, not the truth. And powder had a big role in the art of dissimulation. The faces were almost caricatures. With whites and reds, they looked like they should be on stage. Makeup accentuated expressions, and of course, in France, the 17th century was the century of theatre and the study of expression. At the time, there was lots of jeering. The nobility, with its made-up faces, embodied double meaning, hypocrisy, and the term barefaced, without makeup, has come to mean blatant, unabashed, outright.
This demand for whiteness masked all complexion, because as for linen, the face had to look immaculate. Plus, white evoked the ideal of virginity, an untainted mankind, before being ejected from Eden. A snow-white face meant having a clean, unscarred soul. So white also came to symbolize the idle classes, the aristocracy sheltered from the elements, unlike the peasants with their tanned faces. This quest for whiteness took on all forms, and many of them toxic.
The most widely used skin whitener was Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic known since antiquity. The Greeks and Romans also produced ceruse-based powders, which resulted in extreme irritation to the skin and often irreparable damage. Venetian ceruse also dried out the skin, so if worn all day, it contributed to premature aging of the skin and to wrinkles, and crow's feet much faster than was natural. And ceruse was made from pigment of white lead, a metallic powder, so it caused much more important damage. To the eyes, for example. There were some very serious eye diseases. When ceruse was applied to the throat, it could cause chest irritations and even affect the lungs.
And so, as ceruse could definitely harm the skin, other strategies were found. Fake beauty spots were added as a final touch to cover up the ravages of this fatal product. Some pictures show faces with up to 18 beauty spots covering up as many pockmarks. But before becoming an artifice, the beauty spot was a code of elegance. And for the 18th century courtesan, life could be grueling. 3 whole hours to dress and make up every morning, and then a change of clothes after lunch. The theater, supper, a night of love. A demand for beauty and splendor which often approached excess. So, to be always clean and soigné, a woman's dressing table had all the necessary beauty items. A box for creams, a box for beauty spots, potions, lotions, and perfumes. She even concealed small touch-up items in the folds of her dresses, all more delicate and decorative than the others. Anne Forêt-Carlier shows us some of these objects used at the court from the collection at the Decorative Arts Museum.
At the court, makeup wasn't only put on in the morning. Maybe during the day it needed a little touch-up. So for this, women and men had miniature essentials which they carried on their person. We have some very elegant ones, like this box, containing everything you needed to touch up and freshen up. This one has 2 flasks, one for scent and the other for smelling salts. Smelling salts were very important because if a woman thought she might faint, she immediately took a sniff to regain her spirits. Remember that women wore very tight corsets, which was the main reason they tended to swoon. It has other tools, like these small tweezers, maybe for removing unwanted facial hair. Such objects were probably offered by an admirer to his loved one. And in general, they have inscriptions, as in this case. For example, on this small flask holder, it says, "Nothing is too good for those whom one loves." There are also little maxims like, "A sign of my love." Some of the objects they carried on them were playful, like this small porcelain leg with a beauty spot just above the knee. this little leg opens, and inside you could conceal a love letter, or it could contain powder. Once again, this little scent flask, a very elegant bouquet in porcelain. This one has a stopper at the top, where you fill it with a few drops of scent.
Another color that was high in illusion was red. It was used to emphasize the whiteness of the complexion and as a cover-up for the marks of time. One English writer, Lady Montagu, described Versailles as a gathering of newly flayed sheep. Imagine a plastered face with cheeks the color of fire, veins highlighted with blue, and hair like a white fleece. Because this tyranny of white was found everywhere. No heads of hair or wigs went unpowdered. And beyond the fashion aspect, powder also removed grease from the hair.
People didn't wash their hair. They powdered it. So it was a kind of dry shampoo. And this was clearly not beneficial for the hair.
Wearing a heavy wig every day, filled with dust and infested with parasites, could be very harmful, mainly headaches, fainting, hot flushes and pressure sores. Louis XIV caught a serious illness caused by wearing a wig. In 1696, he had an anthrax attack of his neck. In the King's health report, the physician Fagon described the illness in rather unscientific terms. He said, "It looks very frightening, it resembles dried meat, it's absolutely abominable."
Another preoccupation at the palace was breath. Courtesans did their best, but in vain. Most of the mouths at the court were disaster zones. And yet, various methods were prescribed.
There was a special tooth operator for Louis XIV. Every morning he would bring the king sweet-smelling or astringent plant roots, such as licorice, rosewood or rosemary, so he could brush his teeth with them. They were a precursor of the toothbrush. And he would soak these roots in theriac, an ancestor of toothpaste, if you like. There were also old-fashioned traditional methods, like cleaning your teeth with tobacco, because it was believed to contain disinfectants. Madame de Sévigné, in a letter to her daughter, even described using urine, because urea was also an astringent whitening agent. Women also traditionally concealed small balls of musk in their mouth to disguise a hollow in the cheek caused by the loss of a tooth.
We know Louis XIV had tooth problems early in life. He had recurring abscesses, and finally in 1685, his tooth operator decided to pull out a tooth, but ripped apart the entire upper palate. This meant that from then on, the king had a cavity between his nose and his mouth, and it was constantly filled with pus. So the king had foul-smelling breath. In 1685, the king wasn't 50 yet, and he had practically no teeth. It was a highly topical subject at court, because the king could no longer eat normally. He basically ate only soups and purées, things that didn't require chewing.
At the midpoint of Louis XIV's reign, medicine had barely evolved for 2,000 years. While oral and bodily hygiene seemed far removed from today's customs, and with water practically absent, what about drinking water? Was water deemed drinkable? At Versailles, like everywhere else in the kingdom, people judged the quality of water only by smell and color.
Before the founding of the town of Versailles by Louis XIV in 1671, the only water transported into Versailles was exclusively for the gardens and fountains. At Versailles, water represented 50 years of extensive work, of drainage and surveying, etc., because Versailles was paradoxically built on marshland, without any streams of rivers. The water brought in for the canals, ponds and fountains wasn't fit for drinking. There was a different circuit built to bring in what we call today drinking water.
Once the work was finished, the king and his court could enjoy water fit for drinking at the table. And yet, water was difficult to access, so cunning was needed to obtain it. The counts of Artois and of Provence finally managed to obtain water rights for their horse troughs. As for the people, they had to make do with the town's hand pumps. But cleanliness was not only a matter of access to water. Public latrines had toilet chairs with holes in the seat, and so lacked privacy and stank. And God forbid, if you were down below when bedpan slops were thrown out of the window during the night. Was Versailles really so lacking on commodities? In the 17th century, Louis XIV still held audiences on what we now euphemistically call the throne. He saw nothing indecent in it. On the contrary, it was a great honor. The king also had concealed rooms built for calls of nature close to his study and dressing room. A clothes closet and water closet at the same time. In 17th century dictionaries, under closet, going to one's closet meant going to empty one's bowels.
Here we have wonderful illustrations of what existed at the time for hygiene. Here's a superb toilet chair or closed stool from the reign of Louis XV. You lift the lid to reveal a porcelain pot, and the seat is covered in carpet to provide more comfort. And it had to be emptied once the king had relieved himself. There's one anecdote that tells the tale of a white Angora cat which one day curled up for a snooze in the pot. Louis XVI didn't see it, and when he sat down, the cat gave the king's buttocks some nasty scratches. Louis XVI leaped off, pulling up his hose and breeches, and ran out, leaving the cat rather angry at being disturbed at nap time. At Versailles, there were several types of toilet. We've just seen a French-style toilet, but here's an early 18th century evolution, known as an English-style water closet system, invented in 1727.
In the 18th century, Marie Antoinette continued to use closed stools. There was no toilet paper back then. Cotton and embroidered linen was used at court.
The courtesans continued to use closed stools, but a number of lazy, uncouth valets, rather than go empty the pots in the cesspits dug for this purpose, they would throw the slops straight out of the window with barely the decency to shout, "Watch out below." We're sure there must have been some accidents, as we have copies of the rule officially banning the practice at court.
After the laying out of the palace forecourt, the king had public latrines built, known as pissing walls. But were these enough for the 4,000 people who lived at the palace and for the hundreds who visited every day?
Palace was open to the public, so lots of people were moving around it. The courtesans were never caught short, as they could relieve themselves in the corridors inside. But one-day visitors had to wait until they could find a place. There were a few public latrines which existed under Louis XIII in the early 17th century, but basically Versailles stank of pee and sometimes more.
People urinated where they could. Take the famous story of a prince peeing over the balustrade in the royal chapel, or a courtier relieving himself on a tapestry in full view. However, the more discreet stepped behind a door or into the corner under the stairs.
It was obviously easier for men than for women. Women didn't wear underwear. So there were portable closed stools, which made the rounds of the palace, and women could squat down with their dresses covering the pot.
Women brought a small chamber pot to chapel, It was discreet because they could place it under their dresses. But sometimes you could hear the sound of urinating. These pots became known as bordelus, after the Jesuit preacher Louis Bordelus, whose sermons were painfully long for these ladies. For more discretion on the chair, there were often fake books. Many of them were called Trip to the Netherlands. This because the idea was invented in the 1670s when France was at war with Holland. So lots of Frenchmen at court would have fun saying they were going to defecate on Holland. There were lots of amusing expressions to evoke the more intimate parts of courtly life.
An army of servants was employed to clean the palace. But despite their number, they were powerless against another army which marched between the basements and the attics. Rats, the scourge of towns and palaces alike. And in addition to vermin, there was also the problem of the cesspits, which overflowed and spread disease. Although the cesspits were cobbled and watertight to avoid polluting the groundwater, they weren't emptied regularly.
The cesspits beneath the Palace of Versailles were cleaned out each season. There are accounts of pestilent stenches when a big cleanup was required.
The Queen made several complaints about the stench that rose up from the interior courtyards whenever she opened her windows. All of the small apartments overlooked the inner courtyard, and you can imagine what was going on along the walls down below. What's more, Marie Antoinette often complained that her linen smelled muddy because it had been washed not in fresh running water, but in more or less polluted pools.
But there was even worse. On the death of Louis XIV, the whole palace was deserted. In the town of Versailles, the inhabitants hooked up their cesspits to the aqueducts, which emptied into the pond at Clagny, where the locals drew water and fished. The insalubrities of the town of Versailles therefore caused a series of epidemics and deaths.
When Louis XV returned to Versailles in 1722, the sanitary state of the water must have been disastrous, with unofficial branches in the network and springs surrounded by wastewater. There had been no upkeep of the fountains and their hydraulic system. So Louis XV launched new works to restore the fountains, lay down new sanitary rules for sewers, and to relocate cesspits far away from water sources. Plus, it was decided to use the extraordinary hydraulic machine at Marly, which drew water from the river Seine, and to use some of it as fit for drinking. A lake was built, the Bassin de Picardie, and it was gradually filled with water fit for drinking, which they started to filter.
Other sanitary measures were taken. The garbage which had piled up in the streets and stagnant wastewater were cleared. The pond at Clagny was drained, the cemetery moved outside of the town, and new sewers were built. Hygiene improved thanks to new technology, but also thanks to new trends. While Louis XIV had a bathtub brought into his chamber for medical reasons, Louis XV had 7 bathrooms installed in his private apartments during successive periods of renovation work. Louis XVI, however, only used one of them.
With this new desire for intimacy, the king would have a single room known as the cabinet des bains, entirely dedicated to bathing. So the bathtub was no longer carried in the center of the room, but permanently installed in a specific place. That also meant the absence of servants and thus more intimacy, because when Louis XV took a bath, he was pretty much all alone, because there was now running water. Louis XV had 2 bathtubs, one to wash in and one to rinse off in. So he was more independent when he bathed because he didn't need a valet to empty the bath, wash it, then refill it. There was no rubber back then, so there was no shower hose. And the only way to rinse off was in another bath of clean water. Water was evacuated into the courtyard, underneath which was a reservoir. So it was a very ecological solution, because the collected water could be used for laundry or for the gardens. There are a number of stories told by the royal daughters who were in the courtyard and soaked by their father's bathwater as it was released into the yard.
There was what one might call water savings. This saved water had several uses. It was used for what I would call partial enemas on the newly invented bidet, which enabled a form of intimate hygiene quite different to the form it would take later. It was easier to wash one's armpits thanks to what was known as the half bath. Plus, there were also more bathtubs in various categories, which were much sought after. Diderot's encyclopedia, published between 1751 and 1772, includes an entry on bathtubs which could be purchased. This didn't concern the entire population, but it no longer concerned the aristocracy alone.
During the reign of Marie Antoinette, delicate yet nonetheless royal bathrooms were installed in the Petit Trianon. But they were considered more for relaxation than for washing. Pastime rather than personal hygiene. Doctors still viewed hot water with suspicion. They prescribed purges before bathing and compulsory rest afterwards.
That's why there was a bed in the bathroom, which you can still see at Versailles today. The Queen didn't bath naked, but in a long white flannelette shirt. And when she stepped out of the bath, there were 2 ladies in waiting to hand her a kind of large wrap, so no one could see the Queen with her wet shirt clinging to her body, tantamount to seeing her naked. Consequently, this allowed to avoid prying eyes. This is what we've learned from an account by her chambermaid, Madame Campan. But someone had to help her out of her shirt. It wasn't something she'd have done alone.
And for the royal children, there was no escaping the first bath.
An infant needed to be bathed in warm water, not only to be washed, but also to keep the child soft and flexible, spongy even. And so, it helped nursemaids check the child's posture and readjust the members if necessary. If they didn't have the required form, it would help them accentuate certain forms, like the neck or the loins, for example, to give them the correct angles. So water became a tool for moderation. And after the bath, the infant's body was covered in flakes from oyster shells, so it was well protected, and then it was hugged tightly so that the humors didn't escape, and that was a child's bath time.
Regarding the intimate hygiene of women, there was one last taboo: menstruation.
When women were indisposed, they protected themselves with what were known as warmers, menstrual pads that were probably fixed to a belt on bad days. Marie Antoinette's periods kept coming when she wanted to fall pregnant. She wrote to her mother about this, using their family euphemism, "The wife of General Krottendorf has returned."
In the late 18th century, courtly cosmetics were harshly criticized. Some critics noted the multitude of lotions, potions, and powders overload the brain, block pores, and lead to premature hair loss. Powder is so abundant, at the slightest movement it falls onto the shoulders. Clearly, wigs are not what they used to be. Two generations clashed during the reign of Louis XVI. That of the grandparents, with fixed faces plastered in white and rouged cheeks, and that of the youngsters, who sought a natural look and a fresh complexion.
There was a shift to the natural, and cosmetics also began to move in that direction. And this was clearly due to the Back to Nature works by Rousseau, which were very popular at the court. So cosmetics began to reflect this naturalism. Powders became more discreet, rouge was used little on the cheeks, but a pale complexion was still de rigueur. Then, in the late 18th century, the makeup of the court would be adopted by the nobility in Paris, then by the bourgeoisie, resulting in the makeup we have today, which masks certain conditions. It's no longer exclusive to an elite.
The very meaning of cleanliness had changed. In the future, perfume and powder would no longer conceal foul smells. The purifying and cleaning effects of perfume were no more. Standards of hygiene were no longer dictated by treatises of health and manners, but by doctors. And in the 19th century, to be clean, you had to wash, and with water.